Thank you very much, Matthew, and it's very nice to be here at the RSA. I've been here before, and it's very nice to be here again. I'm going to start straight away, and here we are in Belgrade in 2003, and that's where I was. Sorry, I'm already doing the wrong thing technically. I was there just behind the cortege there. I'm in that big mass there. I'd gone over there to mourn the death of this man, Zoran Djindjic, who a few days earlier had been assassinated. He had been shot on the steps of the federal government offices in Belgrade, and Zoran was an old friend of mine. So I was very distraught at the news, and a month after Djindjic's death, I was at the House of Commons, on the terraces of the House of Commons, having a drink with a few MPs, and one of those MPs said in a frankly rather pompous fashion, we're not going to let the Balkans into the European Union unless they do something about organized crime. And at this time, I, who am usually quite deferential towards MPs, I was unable to maintain my balance and dignity, and I shouted at him. And I shouted at him because a month earlier, this man, Zoran Djindjic, had been assassinated because of organized crime, because 3 months prior to his assassination, he had promulgated the first ever Witness Protection Act in southeastern Europe. And not only had he promulgated the Witness Protection Act, but he had lined up one of the big bosses of Belgrade to testify against several other big bosses. And that's why Zoran was killed, and that's why doing things about organized crime in southeastern Europe is a matter of life or death. And it's a very, very distant experience from MPs sitting on the terraces of the House of Commons and talking about organized crime in theory. And at this point, I wondered to myself, I said, what has gone wrong? Why is Zoran being killed? Because it was only just under 15 years previously that the great event of my lifetime happened, and that was the fall of communism, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the liberation of 250 million people who had been denied their democratic rights by the Soviet Union and the Soviet allies in Eastern Europe. And I was particularly pleased by the fall of communism because for 15 years or so I'd been working as an activist supporting democratic opposition groups in Eastern Europe, like Solidarity in Poland and Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. And one of the things that I would do to this end was to smuggle books and dismembered Xerox machines across the border of Eastern Europe in Romanian trains and things like that. So I knew quite a lot about crime already myself. And so this, for me, was really the sort of culmination of my young life at the time. And really, I thought, I think it's true, an extremely significant event in our history. But there was something else that had been going on before this. Some time, about 4 or 5 years before, we'd seen the beginnings of the liberalization of financial and commodity markets in the Western world, known as globalization. And of course, we all know that what globalization does is to shrink the world. And so I will shrink the world, or try and shrink the world. There it is. Oh, there it goes. The world was shrinking. And it was shrinking because goods and services were moving faster and in bigger numbers all around the world. Trade was increasing, markets were opening, borders were coming down for trade, and that meant that there were a huge amount of opportunities for those people who had the nous and the energy to exploit them. And so we saw coming together these two extraordinary phenomena which were discrete, although I believe that they are, in some indirect ways, very closely connected. Now, some of the people who understood the value of the entrepreneurial opportunities that globalization and the collapse of communism presented themselves were a rather peculiar bunch. Here are some of them. These are some Bulgarians, and they are Bulgarian weightlifters and wrestlers who you may remember from the pre-1989 period, because every 4 years at the Olympics, they always cleaned up the gold medals. And they were a very successful bunch, and they were supported, of course, by the Bulgarian state. They were the celebrities of communism. When communism collapsed, however, it wasn't only the ideology which collapsed, it was the state as well. And that meant that the state was unable to provide the celebrities' lifestyle to characters like these that they had done in the past. And as an aggrieved community, they wanted to express their displeasure at this and do something about it. And they were able to do that in part because they hooked up with another group of people from the communist period who were also rather distressed at the changes that were going on. Between 1989 and 1991 in Bulgaria, 14,000 members of the security services were sacked. Now, when you are in a situation where your economy is tanking very rapidly, where your state is collapsing, you've lost all your markets, the last thing really you want to do is to throw onto the employment market 14,000 people whose primary skills include surveillance, setting up underground networks, smuggling, and killing people. But that's what happened in Bulgaria, and indeed all sorts of other places in Eastern Europe, and they hooked up with our friends, the wrestlers, and very quickly, these people, in the absence of any clear structure of the new police force or the new court system, these people were actually defining the markets. They were saying what could be sold, who would sell it, and so on and so forth. And they looked around the world, and one of the things they discovered is that if you operate in what are traditionally known or understood to be illegal markets, you can make a lot more money than if you work in legal markets. Although, as it happens, these characters were quite happy to operate in any market, legal or illegal. And they discovered that there were all sorts of other people around the world who were also working in illegal markets, and that they could cooperate with them. So in 1992, there was a summit meeting organized by two Italian lawyers on the island of Aruba in the Caribbean between the largest organized crime group in Moscow, with some support from the Bulgarians and the Serbs, on the one hand, and representatives of the Medellin cartel. There's Pablo Escobar, the late head of the Medellin cartel, and the Cali cartel. And what they were doing is they were opening up markets both in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, because they'd reached supersaturation point of the American market for cocaine. North America, as you probably know, is about 5% of the global population. Its consumption of cocaine represents about 40% of global cocaine production. And so the Colombians needed to move cocaine elsewhere in the world to expand their markets, and Europe was a great place to do it. And so they started developing new routes through Africa, through the Balkans, to complement the already proficient routes of Spain and Amsterdam. Now, obviously at this point, civil war was raging in Afghanistan, and so that meant a significant increase in the production of opium, which found its way not only into the European Union, but also into the expanding market of North America, Canada, and the United States in particular. Now, elsewhere, there were some sort of traditional organized crime groups, like the Yakuza in Japan, who, at exactly the same point as the fall of communism, were experiencing a huge boom thanks to what was called the bubble economy in Japan, which was essentially an economy fostered by Japan's corporate giants and Japan's politicians, who were involved in a huge speculative cycle of clearing property, getting rid of the residents, putting up new sort of bright, bubbly buildings and selling them for a huge profit. But in order to get rid of the residents, in order to do that, they needed people like the Yakuza to do it. Well, they didn't need people like the Yakuza, they needed the Yakuza. So the Yakuza were involved in this huge speculative boom, and they made lots of money. And they started investing in places like the United States, particularly the Western United States, Las Vegas, Hawaii, but also in Southeast Asia, which they turned into a large rest and recreation, R&R area, not only for the Yakuza, but increasingly for flows of tourists coming from Europe, particularly men from the Teutonic countries, Scandinavia, Germany, and Holland, who would go to the brothels that they'd set up all over Thailand, the Philippines, and so on. So you were beginning to get a mingling of criminal cultures. Now, there were, unfortunately, some collateral victims of the end of the Cold War, nowhere more so than in Africa. And what we'd seen in Africa during the Cold War was a series of proxy conflicts, which were essentially run by the CIA and the KGB. Bizarrely, that very fact that they were run from afar or financed from afar acted as a restraining influence on the wars in Africa. And when the CIA and the KGB felt after 1989 that they no longer had to involve themselves in these wars in Africa, and they withdrew, the warlords who had grown fat on money from Moscow and Washington sought to replace these funds from other sources. And the most obvious place to go for was the incredibly rich mineral resources of Africa. And so what we saw developing through the 1990s was what I consider to be one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. And that was the sale of the stockpiles of weaponry from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, which were mediated by groups from South Africa, from Western Europe, France, Belgium, from the United States, from Russia and Ukraine itself. And these weapons would be sold through South Africa and East Africa into countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola. And they would be paid for by the wonderful mineral resources of these countries. They would be paid to the criminal syndicates, who would then take the diamonds and infiltrate them into Western markets. Now, the trade with blood diamonds was recognized thanks to the work of a tremendous NGO here in the United Kingdom called Global Witness at a relatively early stage, but there were other ones, and ones which I think it's important to understand because it explains how criminal activity started to intersect hugely with illicit activity around the world during the 1990s. And the most important mineral resource in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Eastern DRC, was a metallic ore called coltan, which is used in every mobile phone, every laptop, and every games console around the world. Now, at the time of the millennium, 80% of the world's coltan was mined in the killing fields of the DRC. That coltan was sold by the paramilitary organizations into these criminal groups, who would then sell it into the illicit market to the electronic manufacturers who made all the phones and all the laptops and all the games consoles. And so all of us exclusively unwittingly. The degree to which the electronic manufacturers understood what was going on is less certain, but all of us unwittingly were using materials that were funding the huge slaughter in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think it's worth pointing this out because in the DRC since 1998, 5.5 million people have been killed. Now we get very hot under the collar about Darfur, where some 300,000 people have been killed since the conflict broke out. To me, what is going on and what has been going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo outstrips anything that we've seen around the world since the fall of communism. And yet, we barely know anything about it, and yet it is driven by our need, in part, for mineral resources from that part of the world. So there's a thing to ponder on. Now, while all that was going on, this is where I was, in the former Yugoslavia. And there's Arkan, and with Arkan is Milica, on loan from Belgrade Zoo at the time, and there are some of his bigger tigers at the back. And it was really the work of people like Arkan that made me understand what was going on around the world. But I will come back to the Yugoslav stuff in a minute. So there we have it. We had this confluence of two huge historical phenomena of the collapse of communism and globalization. And into that mix were this whole bunch of new crime groups who understood one very important thing, and that was that there are people all over the world who are willing and eager to buy illicit goods and services. And so that entire thing created what I call McMafia, an exponential growth in the global shadow economy, which now accounts, through my estimations, between 15 and 20%. I think it's actually more like 15% of global GDP. The figures are culled from a variety of sources, largely academic institutions, but also international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. But when I talk about the global shadow economy, it's not the same as organized crime. What I'm really talking about is an amalgam of organized criminal markets, corruption, which according to the UN is worth just under $3 trillion annually. And the point about corruption is that it multiplies all sorts of illegal markets. And so it's a very, very important part of this whole phenomenon. Corporate fraud and tax evasion. Now, corporate fraud and tax evasion are phenomena which come from the licit world, from actors in the licit world, but their aim is the same as those people operating in the illicit world, which is to avoid detection by the state. And that's why you have to link them together, because in order to evade detection by the state, they find themselves operating in very similar financial markets. And those financial markets are something I'll come on to in a little while. But first of all, I just want to go back as a little micro example of what goes on in the world. Here is the former Yugoslavia. 1991, the world imposes an arms embargo, the United Nations arms embargo on all the republics. Within a matter of days, arms were pouring into Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina from several different parts of the world. They weren't pouring into Serbia because Serbia had the Yugoslav People's Army, which was the fourth largest army in the world at the time. And frankly, they had more weapons than they knew what to do with. The fascinating thing about these weapons is the majority of the weapons coming into Croatia and Bosnia, that is when the Croats decided they would let them into Bosnia, were coming from Russia and Ukraine. Now there's a strange thing. Russia and Ukraine were the great supporters, the pan-Orthodox backers of Serbia. And yet when it came to selling weapons, they were very happy to sell a large amount of weaponry to Serbia's main enemy, Croatia. And that is because in the world of the shadow economy, nationalist conflicts and ethnic differences in most cases, not in all cases, but in most cases, just go out the window. They're not important. Now, as we've already seen, cocaine was now coming through the Balkans. Heroin had traditionally been trafficked by the communist secret polices through Bulgaria and Serbia into Western Europe, but this was joined now by some new commodities. It was joined above all else by trafficked women coming from the former Soviet Union, stopping off in Bosnia-Herzegovina to service the United Nations troops there before going on into Western Europe. And the reason why this is important is because the Balkans had become, during the Yugoslav wars, a transit zone, a huge transit zone for illicit goods and services from coming all over the world, going to the European Union. And this is the key thing, is that the European Union is the favored market of illicit goods and services. By now, it was developing into the largest consumer market in history. And a large part of the cash used in the consumer market is used to buy illicit goods and services. And in 1994, one man decided that there was one commodity which had not really been properly exploited, and this is cigarettes. Cigarettes duty not paid. These are cigarettes manufactured, for example, in the United Kingdom, sold by the tobacco companies, legitimate tobacco companies, into the free trade zones of Europe, which are in Rotterdam and Zug in Switzerland, Rotterdam in Holland, obviously. And from there, they get sent out, they get bought by criminal syndicates. The tobacco companies know nothing about this. I am reliably informed by them. And then they get sent from there and to places like Uzbekistan or northern Cyprus or Egypt. And then they get flown back into the Balkans. They end up in Montenegro. From Montenegro, they get trafficked across to Italy, and there they get loaded by the local mafia group, the Sacro Corona Unita, put onto lorries, back up to Belgium and Holland, and Belgium and France, and taken in white vans across to the United Kingdom, the place where they were manufactured in the first place and sold on the streets of the Holloway Road of North London for about £2 a pack or £1.50 a pack, as opposed to £4.50, £5 a pack. Now, the Chancellor doesn't get any other tax on those cigarettes, but they've been taxed all the same, and everyone involved in that little route is taking a little bit off of that tax. So that when we buy those illegal cigarettes, and to this day about 25% of cigarettes bought in the United Kingdom are duty not paid smuggled cigarettes, when we buy those in the 1990s, we were funding the paramilitaries of southeastern Europe. And this is how it all went. This boat here is worth €1 million. It's the fastest thing on the Adriatic. When this trade started in 1994, the Italian coastal defenses had two boats, one in Ancona, one down in Reggio Calabria, which could compete with this speed-wise. Every night from 1994 to 2001, 20 boats, each worth €1 million, packed full of cigarettes, there you are, there you see them, and there are the gangsters, drove across from the port of Bar in Montenegro to near Bari in Italy, and dropped off this. Sometimes they would take women with them, and if they were assaulted by the Italian police, they would throw the women into the water, so that the Italian police would have to do something about that. Now, you're about to see what it takes to capture one of these boats, because the only way you can capture this boat is for it to run out of petrol. So 20 boats a night. It resulted in the loss of about 4 to 5 billion pounds, sorry, I beg your pardon, to the exchequers of Europe, the bulk of which was the exchequer of the United Kingdom, because our taxes were so high. This is a tax differential scam, essentially. There we go. See, that's 6 boats it requires to take one boat out. And to begin with, in 1994, the Guardia di Finanza and the coastal defenses of Italy had just 2 boats available to them. So this was a trade that was going on and making a lot of money for a lot of people, both in the Balkans and in the European Union. So there he is, he's finally caught. One of the very few, it has to be said. I just want him to stop. There we are. Good, yes. But the very heart of the matter. Ah, Moscow, Moscow. You see that little, the blue thing around Moscow? That's the MCAT, which is Moscow's M25. And here are districts around the MCAT, and amazingly, the names of these districts coincide with the names of the biggest organized crime groups in Russia in the early 1990s. And the reason for that was quite simple, is that's where the working class, that's where the muscle was, the sportsmen, the Afghan veterans, they all lived in these godforsaken suburbs of Moscow. But they are also placed very close, each of them, to either major airports or major river ports, because they had this role as the protectors of early traders. The mafia in Russia, when the state collapsed in 1991, 1992, were the midwives of capitalism. You had the introduction, as well as the collapse of the state, the end of communism, you had the introduction of capitalism. And so without a court system and a policing system to guarantee that contracts entered into would be honored, businessmen sought out the protection of people like Sontsevo, Lyubetsy Ismailovskaya, and Olga Prudnaya. And what would happen is that if you had a business dispute between two businessmen, Businessmen's Protection Service A would meet with Businessman B's Protection Service, and they would sit down, and 9 times out of 10, they would resolve the contractual dispute, and they would tell both Businessman A and B, this is what we've decided, this is what you're going to do, and everyone would do it. On the 10th time, however, they would be unable to agree on the contractual dispute, and they would instead arrange a second meeting, although this one would be on, they would sort of arrange it at Nevsky Prospect at dawn, bring your knives, except of course they didn't bring knives at all. What they brought was RPGs, Kalashnikovs, and everything imaginable. And this was how contract disputes were resolved in Russia in the 1990s. And it meant, of course, that there was no institutional bodies preventing some people getting very rich, but the great bulk of Russia becoming very, very poor. This is something we have to remember when it comes to the phenomenon of Putin, is that under Russia in the 1990s, the life expectancy for males in Russia collapsed to the age of 57. Now, for a country like that, Russia, that is very traumatic. So a lot of people were losing a lot of money, but the gangs and the oligarchs who they were serving were making huge sums of money. Now, the oligarchs were basically involved in the greatest larceny of all time, which was the rape of Russia's mineral resources, taking the gas and the, I have to move that forward because I'm told it looks like his head's severed, but it's not. He was okay. So they made all this money from mineral resources. They knew that the Russian state, which had gone into hibernation, was a powerful residual force, and that the great bear of Russia would emerge at some point, and it would look around after its hibernation with a cracking hangover, and it would want to know who had stolen its honey. And it was the oligarchs, of course, that had stolen its honey. Now, between 1990 and 2000, we saw the export of between $200 and $300 billion out of Russia and into various parts of the world. Ironically, at the same time, the IMF pumped about $200 billion into Russia to stabilize the ruble. So we were, in fact, subsidizing the Russian oligarchs and their rape of the mineral resources of that country. And, but as I say, they knew that the Russian state were back, and so they got their money out. And of course, they had to take it places. Now, this is where the great boon of globalization coincided with the stuff that was going on in Russia, because there was huge competition around the world for people to get the capital which globalization was beginning to generate. And we saw the emergence of a market, a financial market that was entirely unregulated, largely in places like the ones you're seeing now, but also in obscure places like Iceland, the City of London to some degree. Governments were no longer able to keep track of how much money was swilling around the world, what it was being used for, and what its provenance was. And this is a really central issue of what's happened in the last 15 years or so, is that money laundering has become a very, very easy occupation. There have been some attempts, haphazard, to do something about it, but it is really key now, if you want to do something about the global shadow economy, to address the issue of the international financial system. Personally, I believe politically now is the time to do it because of the fact that the subprime has brought the whole operation into disrepute. Now, I'm going to try and hurry along, as I see, as always, I'm overrunning, although I try my best not to. Globalization was also changing habits, homogenizing cultures. These Bedouins here are smuggling heroin across the border from Egypt into Israel. I caught them purely by chance. And well, the reason why they're doing it is because Israel was changed hugely in the 1990s, because both of the Russian population immigrating into Israel, 15% of the Israeli population is now a Russian population, but also because of globalization. Israel bought into globalization. The Second Intifada hadn't yet started, so things were peaceful. There was a huge economic boom. And along with this boom, particularly on the west coast in Israel and Netanya and elsewhere, there was an incredible proliferation of new lifestyles in Israel, and there was huge demand both for designer drugs and also for prostitutes. And Israel is a very important place for the development of the trafficking of females from around the world for sexual purposes. But here we come to the 101, the backbone of organized criminal syndicates around the world, and that is narcotics, drugs. And here we see a farm in British Columbia, a marijuana farm in a basement in central BC. There are 25,000 grow operations, according to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, in the Greater Vancouver area alone. It's now worth about 5% of British Columbia's GDP. There is nothing that law enforcement can do about this, because what has happened around the world is that since the early 90s, there's been a huge increase in the flow and the consumption of narcotics, but there has not been a concomitant increase in the resources available to law enforcement to do something about this. And the problem is about the war on drugs, which is essentially the policy that the Western world and large parts of the rest of the world pursue to this day, is that it is posited on a law enforcement capacity which can do something about the levels of production and consumption. And we cannot do that anymore. This is the reason why. If you look at the profits made out of cocaine, heroin, or coffee, it's obvious which the entrepreneur in Colombia, in a rural area, is going to go for. The profits are just astronomical. And those profits are essentially conferred on the commodities because of prohibition. That is what makes cocaine and heroin so valuable, just as alcohol was in the 20s and 30s. This is Inspector Brian Cantera of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police showing me around a cavernous warehouse east of Vancouver of some of the objects that they confiscate on a daily basis in British Columbia. It does nothing to the flow of traffic across the border to the United States, because BC, of course, exports a lot of its cannabis. And here we see what has happened to the price of cocaine, wholesale and retail, since the beginning of the second phase of the war on drugs by Ronald Reagan. Basically, in economic terms, it doesn't work, and this is where it becomes a real problem, and that is Afghanistan. In 2003, the Taliban were a defeated force militarily. And for the first time in 150 years, outsiders had the opportunity to stabilize that country as never before. But instead, in our wisdom, the United States and the United Kingdom went to Iraq and neglected the development of Afghanistan. The Taliban understood this, took this as a way of reorganizing itself, refinancing itself, and then rearming itself. And it refinances itself exclusively through the 10% taxation which it puts on every opium transaction going in and out of Afghanistan. And with the profits from that trade, which now run into tens of millions every month, they are now on the verge of inflicting a catastrophic defeat on history's most powerful military alliance, NATO. And the war on drugs and the war on terror, or our strategic long-term interests in Central Asia, are, as a consequence, incompatible. On a lighter note, let me introduce you to Senor Pringle, who I met in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And as you can see, Senor Pringle is no ordinary crisp packet. He's attached to that very computer here with that thing, and that turns him into a directional antennae. And with the help of a friend of mine called Super Geek, he enabled me to drive up and down the Avenue Paulista and break in to 3 major Brazilian banks' computer systems. I have to say it was largely Super Geek who was able to do that, but it was my computer. And so cybercrime is the biggest growing sector of organized crime around the world. But the interesting thing about cybercrime is that it is not primarily an issue of technology. It is much to do with human behavior. And of course, it didn't take hackers very long to work out that the easiest way into a person's computer is through sex. Here we have I Love You. I don't know if you remember in the late 1990s, the I Love You virus, which spread around the world, one of the first great viruses. Well, mercifully, the first person I received the I Love You virus from was an ex-girlfriend of mine. And she harbored all sorts of emotions towards me, but love was most definitely not one of them. And so as soon as I saw this, I was able to throw it into the recycle bin, and I spared myself a very nasty infection. All I can say is that you must maintain your antiviral and anti-malware programs, but even so, you might be vulnerable. If you look at what happened, there's a group of hackers, one of whom I met, who was involved in something that became known as Operation Pegasus. They sent out millions of spam emails from Brazil to the UK, to the US, Spain, Portugal, and Brazil every month. And they get a tiny response in statistical terms, in percentage terms, but that is still 27,000 responses with passwords and account details every single month, and they made about £135 million in the space of about 5 months. So do be very, very careful about what you do with your computer. The interesting thing about it is that it used to be, when you used to get these viruses, they used to eat up your hard disk or send you to pornographic sites and this sort of thing. Nowadays, within the space of 3 years, this has turned around completely. You don't know if you've been affected, because the whole community of hackers have been infected by criminalization. This is where the centers are, and it's because of this phenomenon that involved with globalization of wealth discrepancy. Wealth discrepancy has been growing since the early 90s between the North and the South, between the West and the South, within the West and within the South. And nowhere do you get wealth discrepancies as great as Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They have infrastructures, however, which everyone can access. And young people who want to join in the whole globalized cultures of trainers and music and drugs and whatever else they want to do, the only way that they can get access to this money on the whole is using computers, and often in a criminal a criminal way. But that's quite an interesting, complex subject. To finish up, the future of organized crime, well, China is an absolutely fascinating place because what happened in the 1990s is we began this huge process of shifting our manufacturing capacity away from the West and to Asia, which means that we become very dependent on service industries and on creative industries. And if you're dependent on creative industries, then intellectual property rights are absolutely critical to your economic development. The Chinese and other Asian countries, their priority is very different. They just want to produce, and sell to us because they have to create jobs the whole time. Particularly in China, it has to create 24 million jobs a year if it is to ward off the sort of cataclysmic social unrest which the leadership in Beijing has always been terrified of. And that means when you're producing that amount of goods to be sold in the West, that you cut corners on things like intellectual property rights. If you're cutting corners on intellectual property rights, all sorts of dodgy operators are selling their stuff into the retail chain. And this is becoming the central area of dispute between the West and Asia as the globalizing world develops over the next 15 years or so. And so the issue of organized crime actually gets to the heart of one of the central issues facing our global economic development in the near future. And that, I think, is quite enough from me. Thank you.